Hello, everybody. It's me, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994.
Within an hour or so of meeting him, both my parents had completely fallen under Fred's gentle spell. Dad exuded genuine bonhomie, and Mum became coy and quite kittenish. They spoke to him as if he was the son they'd never had, and Mum especially used a completely different tone of voice to the sharper way she addressed me. When they talked about him, it was almost with reverence. I'd never seen either of my parents so hospitable to anyone other than their own rich, smart friends like Harry Oppenheimer and Peter Barlow and those people, highly rich. Birch Bernstein was another one, head of Anglo-Val. And certainly never to anyone of our generation, even though Fred was 5 years older than I was. Mum even gave him the spare room to sleep in, with its ensuite bathroom, when normally, to prevent any hanky-panky under her roof, she'd have put bachelors as far away from our bedrooms as possible, either in the thatched janine, the rondavel outside the kitchen where the servants did the ironing and laundry on a wet day. The sorter and overseer for the shearing gang had always been quartered there. Or single men went into our old nursery, which was tacked onto the other end of the house, beyond the kitchen and long pantry, at the very opposite end of the house to our rooms. It was extremely tempting to creep up the passage from my room, Nicolette's original bedroom, and sneak Fred out of the spare room and down to mine. But Mum had a bat's echolocation quality hearing, and getting caught wouldn't have been worth it. We'd probably both be banished from New Forest forever, and I'd be cut off without a penny, as Dad always threatened to do to any of us daughters who even thought about disobeying either of them. Our first morning there, my mother said, "Take Fred down to the river to show him the best places to fish." We walked down the red dirt road and through the bottom paddock in front of the house to where the river meandered in a loop around the contours of the big field. Part of the bush encroached into the far side of the bank, and underneath the cool green trees there was a thick carpet of moss. We sank to our ankles in the velvety lushness of it, and behind us, in a natural semicircle, was a thick hedge-like growth of dark green ferns. At that time of the year, early spring, creamy arum lilies looking like furled linen table napkins in a smart restaurant grew in clumps, and under their white speckled spear-shaped leaves, a profusion of pale pink, tiny, delicate flowers of the orchid family, we called them granny bonnets, had sprung up. This natural garden overlooked a deep pool in which we'd often swum in the past. It was a rockier, shallower pool than our usual bathing place, and there was an old knobthorn tree which hung out over the water, and on the branches of which the greater honeyguide often perched. It was a perfect place for golden-spotted trout to lie hidden in the dapples, just out of the main current and near enough the bank to be able to dart to safety when the resident pair of giant kingfishers came swooping up and down the river, cackling like kookaburras. I took the rod, still in its green canvas case, gently out of Fred's hand and put it carefully on the ground. Then I slid my arms around him, and without a word I took the hem of his shirt and slowly peeled it off him. I dropped to my knees on the thick cushion of soft moss, pulling him down smoothly with me. What? Here? We can't. Gosh, really? Oh, wow. He was slightly shocked, then delighted at the idea. I wasn't sure if we could be seen from the house. Only the baboons would know that. Perhaps at that very minute Mum was standing there on the front veranda, peering at us through my dad's binoculars. I didn't care. This was a precious moment to be captured for the future. Later I lay back, my elbows deep in the cool moss, my back propped comfortably on a knee root of a yellowwood tree, watching Fred cast expertly, working his way slowly upstream as his fly landed again and again on the ripples, which turned to sequins in the midday sun. I loved fishing too. When we were small, Grandpa taught us how to cast. He'd stood on the front lawn and guided our hands to perfect the slow, lazy flick that puts the fly, followed by the line, onto the water without disturbing the surface. Fred kept the tip of his rod low and to the side. Unlike me when I fished, I always cast too high and got my fly tangled up in whatever foliage lay behind me. Idly I wondered if the trout he was angling for were descendants of our faithful old pet fish who'd made his home in the pool next to the watermill. Bring him up to the farm any time you want, my parents told me. He's more than welcome here, and he can treat this place as his second home. Fred and his mother kept in touch by phone fairly regularly while he was in South Africa, and each time they spoke, she asked him when he was coming home to Scotland for good. Originally, he told her that once the contract at Pier Number 2 in Durban was completed at the end of 1969, and if there was no other job immediately lined up for him, he might go back to the UK. The pier job finished at the end of that November, and straight afterwards Christiane Nielsen started another contract. They were to build a big ridge over a road to wharves on the bluff side of the port, to an area that would become the massive container docks. To his mother's utter dismay and huge disappointment, Fred began work there at the beginning of December. In July 1970, a year after we met, Fred had to fly back to the UK for several weeks. He needed to go to Cambridge to a ceremony during which he would collect his MICE, Member of the Institute of Civil Engineers certificate. Then he took a train up to Scotland to spend a bit of time with his parents at Glencrusen Castle, where they were spending the summer. While he was in England for those weeks, Fred offered me his flat, but I felt it was better if I stayed in the boarding house, if only to give my subterfuge of lies some legitimacy. I took him to the airport and drove back to the boarding house, and I would use it now and again, the flat, at the weekends. While he was in England, his mother tackled him again on the subject of when he was coming home. That was when he told her that he would be going back to South Africa, probably for a very long time, as he'd met somebody in Durban. This news wasn't well received. Mummy and Bob didn't sound too thrilled, he told me wryly, but there was nothing they could do, and he flew back with a sense of relief that she would let the subject of his return go for a while. After I'd fetched him from Durban Airport, we drove back to his flat to celebrate his return. Later, as we sat back in our cane chairs on the balcony with glasses of wine, watching the harbour gradually sparkle into its night adjustment, Fred leant over and took both my hands carefully in his and looked into my eyes. "Babe, will you marry me?" "Yes," I whispered. The next morning, a Saturday, we strolled hand in hand down a sunny street, to a manufacturing jeweller's workshop in the centre of Durban, and looked through a treasure trove of dozens of cut diamonds, graded in their sizes and colours, nestling in twists of white tissue paper. Together we chose a large diamond and two pale blue matching Ceylon sapphires, which had been set aside for women who had ordered them for a pair of earrings, but who'd never come back. The jeweller, an elderly Swiss craftsman called Monsieur Savy, set the diamond in white gold claws on a gold ring and flanked the glittering stone with the two sapphires, also secured by white gold. It looked magnificent as I tried it on in his workshop. The ring was a perfect fit and sparkled and flashed as it caught the bright workshop lights when I held my hand out to admire it. After a few minutes, Fred asked me to remove it, and Monsieur Savy handed him a small dark blue velvet box lined with cream silk. Fred placed the ring carefully in the box and slipped it into his pocket before he paid the old Swiss jeweller. "Now I have to ask your father for your hand in marriage," Fred said, showing for the first time since I'd met him a fleeting look of anxiety at the prospect. "Should we do it next weekend?" We drove up to the farm the following Friday. Fred was quite nervous by now. "I think I'll ask your dad as soon as we get there, and then I can relax and spend the rest of the weekend enjoying myself and perhaps doing a spot of fishing," he said. It was just getting dark as we drove over the cattle grid in the inevitable cloud of dust, the first stars starting to twinkle in the clear, chilly sky. And as usual, the servants ran out to greet us and carry our bags into the house. My oldest sister, Nicolette, and Robin, her husband, and their two little boys, William and Richard, had arrived from Durban half an hour before us and had already settled in. Mum and Dad were delighted to see Fred again, and they gave us a cup of tea in the glassine while we caught up with bits of family news. The evening rushed by, and soon it was time for drinks before supper. A fire crackled in the big sitting room fireplace, and the room, lit softly from the corners by shaded lamps that reflected off glinting, polished brass bed warming pans, which hung on the walls, looked warm and inviting. The scene was completed by a capacious chintz-coloured sofa and armchairs, and Persian rugs lay on the gleaming, mellow yellowwood floor. Masango called us into the dining room for supper, and then, all too soon, it was bedtime, and we trailed off. This time, Fred had been given a room in the nursery, as my sister and her husband were in the spare room with their two lively little boys in Delia's old room next door. Fred still hadn't had the opportunity to ask my father the important question. There was too much going on and too many people about. "I'll do it after breakfast tomorrow," he said. "Then we can go fishing." But it was late winter. The trout was spawning in the streams, and the fishing season was closed for another couple of weeks. Instead, we all climbed into my father's Land Rover, and he drove us to the top of the escarpment, where he had a contractor building a huge dam across the biggest flay. He planned to flood it and create a good-sized fishing lake of 200 acres of water. We drove even further up to the stream that fed into the main flay and watched as thousands of trout thrashed in the sparkling, clear, shallow waters, the females laying their eggs on gravel beds and the cockfish then spreading their own milt over to fertilize them. There were a couple of ospreys perched on rocks on the hillside, gorged on fish, and big pitch-black African crows picked over trout carcasses. We had a braai on a big, wide, flat boulder overlooking the flay, and sat back contentedly on the rocks with cans of lager, enjoying the scenery. Fred still hadn't been able to draw my father aside to ask him the question, and we were going back to Durban tomorrow. Dad got up and stretched. "I think I'll go for a little stroll," he said. Fred stood up too. "I'll join you," and they walked over the hillside and out of sight. 20 minutes later, they came walking slowly back. Dad flopped down in the deck chair next to Mum and, tilting his head back, pushed his hat forward over his eyes, went to sleep, mouth open and snoring loudly. The 3 or 4 pink gins he'd consumed during our lunch were taking effect. When Fred sat back down on the rug I'd stretched out over the dry winter grass, his face looking rather flushed, I whispered, "And so?" I couldn't do it. I couldn't ask him while he was having a wee. There was a slightly desperate look in his eyes now. "I'll have to try again tonight." Later that afternoon, as the sun sank down towards the jagged, snow-covered peaks of the distant Drakensberg, turning the late winter felt grass to a mellow gold in its softening rays, we walked back to the Land Rover along the shores of the new lake. The dammed streams were already filling it up to cover the marshland. It was sad to lose our big flea. It had its own kind of beauty. It teemed with hidden, secretive wildlife. It was the haunt of marsh owls, wading birds, and waterfowl of every description, as well as Cape clawless otters, which fed on crabs and played, splashing out about among reeds, jumping and twisting out of the water as dolphins do, exuberant with the sheer joy of life. There are other slightly smaller flays, though, in the hilltops at the very top of the farm where the Umgeni River begins, as trickling springs, gradually merging to become a fast-flowing, sparkling crystal stream that tumbled over rocks and around boulders, eventually to plunge over the escarpment and down into our valley. That's all I'm going to tell you today. Clearly, more excitement next week. I also want to thank John Muslane for being my sound engineer. Without him, I could not produce any of these works. So many thanks to John for being the star that he is. It's goodbye from me until next week.
That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Muslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.